big news in 2021 was how very profitable these attacks on critical infrastructure providers were.
Hey everyone, and welcome to a special edition of the Industrial Security Podcast. Today, I am without my usual co-host, but I have a guest that some of you are familiar with, Andrew Ginter.
Hello, Nate. It's always a pleasure to chat with you, and I'm looking forward to a little bit of a different episode this time.
I am too. The topic of today's episode is going to be a review of the year that we just lived through and a look forward into 2022 with some trends and a few predictions. So, Andrew, before we get started, just tell the listeners a bit about yourself.
Sure thing. Where to begin? I started my career, bouncing around between different projects. I did some network component manufacturing, writing firmware for communications protocols. I worked a bit with Honeywell Multics, which was at the time it was the first widely used secure operating system. So I got sort of a taste of security then. I sort of landed more permanently in the industrial control system world. I worked for a long time on Hewlett Packard's high-end industrial control system product that automates pipelines and power plants. I wound up at Agilent Technologies doing IT/OT middleware, which connected a whole bunch of control systems to the leading enterprise resource planning provider at the time, which was SAP, thereby connecting a lot of control networks to enterprise networks and contributing to the cybersecurity problems that now plague many industries. In a sense, I got religion. I wound up chief technology officer at Industrial Defender, developing the world's first industrial SEM, security information and event management system. And, after a while there, I signed with Waterfall, and I'm the industrial security vice president here. Waterfall's mission is to make the world a safer place by deploying unidirectional security gateways. Along the way, I've written 2 books on industrial security. I'm the co-author of the Industrial Internet Consortium, focused on the industrial internet, the IIoT. I was the co-author of the IIC Security Framework document. I'm a frequent contributor to standards and best practice guidance, and I try to add value in lots of different ways.
And I'm just a podcast host. So now that we've introduced ourselves, Andrew, let's get into some of the landmark incidents in OT security in 2021. I think the big one, it was technically December 2020, but the news of it, figuring it out, a lot of us were reeling from the SolarWinds attack. Probably to that point, in my estimate, the biggest cyber attack in like a decade, maybe?
Definitely. The bad guys broke into SolarWinds. SolarWinds was a victim here. Broke into SolarWinds and inserted malware into the SolarWinds Orion product, which is a firewall configuration manager. And between 17,000 and 18,000 customers downloaded that security update and presumably installed it. And, the big question in my mind is, what impact did this have on industrial sites? And I don't do incident response myself. This is not, Waterfall is a technology provider, not a services provider. But I do get around. I listen to services providers. I listened to a business that, was talking about SolarWinds, and they had done a bunch of incident response, and they concluded that, in spite of the SolarWinds Orion product being widely deployed on industrial networks, in their experience, not one of them had installed the update, even 6 months after the update came out. Why? Because it takes a long time to install updates. So it was a near miss for industrial sites. Everyone said, "Oh shoot," and went and investigated and said, "Oh, we haven't got around to installing the update yet." So it's a close call, and it reminds us of the difficulty of keeping these sites up to date.
Right. And the other major incident, of course, was the Colonial pipeline attack, which made gas really prohibitively expensive and difficult to get for myself and like 100 million other Americans.
That's right. That was very big news. Resulted in a presidential directive to the largest petrochemical pipeline operators in the United States to improve their security. and it was ransomware. And a ransom of between $4 and $5 million was paid. A large fraction of that ransom was later recovered because apparently the ransomware group fumbled the job of laundering the money, because they're a criminal organization. They can't just spend the money. If they try, it gets reclaimed. But still, big news. It is the most consequential critical infrastructure cyber breach in certainly in American history, possibly in the world's history.
Okay, now the third, I would say, major attack that didn't quite get the mainstream attention of SolarWinds and Colonial, but hit a lot of the same beats as SolarWinds, and for the cybersecurity world had a very similar impact, was Kaseya.
That's right. Now, Kaseya was an IT attack, but it was I've been predicting for some time that ransomware groups are sort of behind the curve on their attack technology. They're behind the nation states by give or take 5 years. And if you look at breaches like SolarWinds, the SolarWinds is sort of an extreme, what's called a supply chain breach, because the malware was inserted into the Orion security update product, posted on the SolarWinds website and on their software update systems, and people who trusted the update downloaded it and now were infected with the malware. So it was a software supply chain breach. Kaseya was a similar thing. It was a software supply chain breach. In this case, the bad guys used a vulnerability they had discovered in one of the Kaseya software update servers, and they used that vulnerability to distribute ransomware simultaneously to 1,500 victims. And so you look at the history of nation-state supply chain breaches. There was the NotPetya breach in 2017. There was another couple of less public breaches. There was the very public SolarWinds in 2020. And here we are in 2021, 4.5 years after the NotPetya breach, and Kaseya gets breached. And it's not a nation-state doing it. It's ransomware. So it's important because ransomware, in a sense, has caught up to what the nation states were doing 5 years ago. And they're using the cloud, the internet, to distribute their ransomware simultaneously to thousands of victims. And, this was a very profitable breach for that group. And, I'm looking forward that this is something we're all going to have to be worried about in the future, because it's so profitable. And, these criminal groups are driven by profit.
Right. And for as consequential as it is, though, Andrew, it still seems like a lot of the targets of the Kaseya attack were IT-based. What was the impact in the OT sector specifically?
To my knowledge, there was no impact in the OT sector of the Kaseya breach. I scrounged the public reports. I did not see a public report of OT downtime, of industrial production downtime due to Kaseya. So it is evidence that the ransomware groups are tracking nation-state attack techniques. And these ransomware groups tend to use these attack techniques, these nation-state attack techniques, first on IT targets and then later on in the OT world. So we're still waiting for the other shoe to drop on that one.
Is there any example that you could think of a kind of attack that was common in IT and then started to migrate over to OT later on?
Sure. I mean, the classic one is it's not an attack, it's an attack technique. The technique is targeted attacks. You remember back in 2006, 2007, the American Department of Homeland Security started coming out with strong warnings saying, hey, pay attention. At the time, they called it advanced persistent threats, which was sort of code for Chinese intelligence agencies, are targeting American and other businesses with this new attack technique. And it really wasn't that new. It was something nation states had done to each other for a long time. But this is sort of when it came into the public understanding of, we're all being targeted this way. And it's the classic, we call it targeted attacks nowadays. You steal a password or you trick someone into clicking on an attachment and you get a foothold of some kind in a target network. And then the foothold is something that you plant some malware there. It phones out to the internet. It doesn't phone it. It connects out to the internet. Beacons is the technical word, to a command and control center. The attackers rendezvous with that connection, the beacon, on the command and control center, and now they operate the attack software manually, remotely, and they look around, and it's one-on-one. It's the attack people reaching through your network, finding, creating accounts for themselves, finding passwords, finding password hashes, planting, backup copies of the malware in different places, and eventually, in the IT space, finding information and stealing it, and in the OT space, planting their ransom, straight into the OT networks. And this is something that, nation states were doing in 06, 07. It came to light that they were doing against private industry. The ransomware group started doing it about 5-6 years later, and this is now sort of the standard technique for ransomware, both on IT networks and when they target OT networks directly.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the Kaseya attack because it feels like even though there wasn't a huge OT impact this time, the principles behind it are going to be very impactful in 2022 for OT. But before we do that, Andrew, any other major incidents worth talking about from 2021 other than the big three that we mentioned?
I'll just do a bit of name dropping here. I don't know that any of them were that, have any deep insights for us. But, shortly after Colonial, there was JBS Meatpacking, suffered a ransomware attack, allegedly paid, I think, more than $10 million in ransom in a single sort of lump sum. To get their 4 or 5 meatpacking plants, massive plants worldwide, back up. So another sort of big data point in terms of, this is profitable if you hit these critical infrastructure providers. There was the Oldsmar, Florida incident, which did not have serious consequences, but got a lot of press. And, it was an example of an attack on a small water system with limited cyber defenses, which I'd like to talk about a little bit later in sort of my predictions for the coming years. And there was a bunch of other incidents. Westrock Paper got hit and had to shut a bunch of plants down. The Palfinger Group that produces cranes suffered a week of downtime at all of their 30 plants worldwide. A boat maker suffered production downtime. There were business disruptions at Fujifilm. Now, it wasn't a production disruption, but for a period of time, Fujifilm was unable to take orders for their COVID tests because they manufacture massive numbers of COVID tests, and this is very bad in the middle of a pandemic. So, an example of societal impacts from IT attacks on critical infrastructure manufacturers.
I think that a few of those attacks that we mentioned really started to kick off something in the zeitgeist. I want to use this as a way to transition into the trends that are with us today in OT security. For example, we all know SolarWinds really kicked off this supply chain thing, and Colonial really hit home with the threat of ransomware. Andrew, what are the trends that are still hot today that you're encountering in your day-to-day work in OT security?
Oh, there's a bunch of it. Let me start with Kaseya. It's Kaseya, SolarWinds. Let's not use the names of the victims. Let's give this class of attack a name. Let's call it cloud-seeded ransomware, which means a ransomware criminal group compromises a victim. The first victim being a vendor, a provider of cloud services of some sort. Kaseya provided software updates to a bunch of managed security customers. The SolarWinds, provided software updates to their products, compromise a cloud system and use that compromised system to distribute malware simultaneously to thousands of sites. It's bad when it hits IT, thousands of IT sites at a time. It's even worse if, I'm predicting a couple of years from now, that same class of attack is going to target an industrial software supplier and simultaneously seed malware into thousands of industrial sites, shutting down thousands of factories at once, in the worst case, thousands of power plants at once. This will be very, very bad. And, this actor is going to be able to extract massive amounts of money from this kind of attack. And so, fundamentally in this cloud connectivity space, I see a lot of industrial sites connecting to the cloud. And, they're out there doing supply chain security audits, saying, how trustworthy is this supplier? Is this supplier under the thumb of a foreign government? Do they have some security systems in place? And people come back and say, yes, this is a trustworthy cloud services supplier. They're asking the wrong question in my mind. They're asking the question, do we trust the vendor? The question they should be asking is, do we trust the vendor's website? Do we trust the vendor's cloud systems? Because those systems are software. All software has defects. All software can be compromised. And when a trusted website is compromised and malware is seeded there instead of a security update, or when a trusted cloud service is compromised and the cloud service says to the industrial internet, hey, go and update all your firmware with ransomware, at thousands of sites simultaneously, this is a very big problem. This is going to be very profitable for the bad guys. And I see it coming. We need, to sort out, what are we trusting?
I spend a lot of my time talking to folks on the IT side of things. And what I was hearing a lot of following SolarWinds, and then particularly when the same kind of thing happened after Kaseya, was this notion of zero trust, this philosophy that you need to get rid of all of your external connections, no data coming into your systems that isn't your own. I'm not sure if any companies actually fully implement zero trust, but that seemed to be what was in the discourse. And in some ways, it reminds me of a lot of OT security philosophy. We talk a lot about air gapping, for example. Andrew, I don't know if you're familiar with zero trust or if this is an equivalent kind of idea in OT security, but does this sound like it could be the solution to what you're talking about?
Let's define zero trust. I define zero trust a little differently than you just outlined. To me, zero trust is what you do on the internet. I mean, I'm working right now in my basement. In the world of COVID, just like a lot of people are working in their basement on a laptop connected to the internet, and this is different from a laptop or a computer connected to a corporate network in an office downtown. In the office downtown, that computer tends to be instructed to trust everything on the local network because the local network is, in quotes, secure. And so you don't need to give a password when you connect to the printer saying, here, print this. You don't need to give a password when you connect to the, the DNS server, the sort of infrastructure services, you trust those connections. You may not need to encrypt a connection to a file server because you're confident that nobody on the network is trying to steal the packets as they come by. So the difference between that environment and the internet is here in my laptop in the basement, I encrypt everything. If I connect to a service on the internet, it's going to challenge me with a password. It might challenge me with two-factor authentication. Nobody trusts anybody on the internet until you get an encrypted connection established and some credentials exchanged. And in my understanding, zero trust as a philosophy is saying, take that model of, yes, I trust the corporate network, and say, no, I don't anymore. Treat every device as untrustworthy until you have an encrypted connection and credentials exchanged. You treat the corporate network as if it were the internet. There's issues with doing that in industrial networks, but the big issue is not how can we apply this to the industrial side. The big issue is, if we did this on the industrial side, would it solve the problem? And this particular problem, it would not solve, because if the SolarWinds Orion software update is compromised, and I connect to the SolarWinds security support website, and I log in, I establish an encrypted connection, I give my credentials, and I pull the attack inside the encrypted connection onto my machine. Or if I log into my industrial vendor's website and pull their security update that's been contaminated with malware, I am pulling the attack through a zero trust encrypted authenticated connection. Zero trust, it helps when you're dealing with what's called man-in-the-middle attacks, third parties trying to get into an existing connection and mess with it. It does nothing when the endpoint is compromised. And what we're talking about here with Kaseya and SolarWinds is compromised endpoints. The bad guys are hitting thousands of victims at once by compromising trusted endpoints.
Is the solution endpoint security?
It's more complicated than that. Endpoint security is obviously part of the solution. You need your endpoints to be hardened. But if you steal credentials, you can still log into a hardened endpoint. It's a bigger problem than that. You need endpoint security. You need encryption. You need zero trust. You need unidirectional gateways. You need to put a package of this stuff together before you get anywhere close to a robust security posture.
Did you know that power plants are exempt from 1/4 of NERC-CIP requirements when those plants use Waterfall's unidirectional security gateways? NERC-CIP does not demand that power plants use the gateways, but the regulations recognize the strength of unidirectional protections. The regulations reward sites who use gateways by dramatically reducing the number of security rules for those plants. For details on the exemptions, please download Waterfall's latest report on the NERC-CIP standards. You can find the report on the waterfall-security.com website in the Resources tab under eBooks and White Papers.
All right, so that was cloud-seeded attacks. Andrew, what other trends have you been seeing on the ground lately?
The trend, the big news in 2021 was how very profitable these attacks on critical infrastructure providers were. $4 to $5 million, extracted from Colonial, $10 or $11 million extracted from JBS. Lots of lesser targets with presumably multi-million-dollar payouts. If your critical infrastructure is down, you are extremely motivated to bring it back up, no matter what the cost. And so, one of my predictions looking forward is that we're going to see attacks that are deliberately targeting critical infrastructure more so than they do now. And when I say critical infrastructure, I mean critical industrial infrastructure. We're already seeing attacks on critical financial infrastructure. We're already seeing attacks on hospitals, which are a kind of critical infrastructure. But I think, the space I work in, power plants, pipelines, manufacturing plants, the big news there is that we're going to see more and more ransomware attacks deliberately targeting OT systems.
And do we have any evidence that is already starting to happen?
Well, in terms of evidence, I'm still doing the research on incidents and trying to paste trends and charts together. But I will say that other analysts are predicting the same thing. So the Gartner Group in December of 2021 issued a prediction that 30% of critical infrastructure organizations are going to be breached by 2025. And they're saying they will experience a security breach that will result in the halting of operations or of mission-critical cyber-physical systems.
Actually, now that we're in 2022 and 2025 is only a few years away, that number, 30% of organizations, seems a little high to me.
Well, 30%, it does seem a little high and it doesn't. On the one hand, the statistics I'm looking at indicate there's, maybe a few dozen organizations worldwide that have been hit by, that have suffered production shutdowns in the industrial space that I'm familiar with in the last couple of years. So that, 30% might seem high. But on the other hand, all it takes is another Kaseya or 3 targeting critical infrastructure providers and, having hundreds or thousands of physical sites shut down, physical operations, industrial operations, power plants, manufacturers shut down because they've been compromised with ransomware, and your 30% gets up there really fast.
Andrew, I'm not sure I'm going to let you get away with that statement without defending it a little bit. Are you talking about a full-scale hundreds or thousands of factories shutting down all at once because of one attack?
I am. The software update example perhaps doesn't that SolarWinds and Kaseya directly perhaps doesn't fit the industrial space terribly well, because you don't see a lot of machines with security updates auto-enabled, auto-installed on industrial sites. But you do see connections to industrial clouds. You do see devices, industrial Internet of Things devices on industrial networks that are monitoring stuff, that are controlling stuff, that are doing stuff. And these devices, there's an expectation that the vendor is going to manage the firmware on these devices. Now, they might have a software interface. The users might be able to go in there and say, I only want the software on these devices updated when I allow you to. I'm going to test your new release. Then I'll say which devices get which new release. There might be a user interface for that in the cloud that gives the users the illusion that they're controlling the software update process. But in fact, the vendor's software pushes the new firmware to these devices whenever the software determines is right. Whenever the software determines is consistent with the instructions that have been received from the end user. And if you take over that mechanism and say, nuts to that, just send it out now, it's all over. Now you've got the nasty installed as new firmware simultaneously on thousands of devices at hundreds of sites. And what does that do? Well, if it's ransomware, presumably it disables the device. Is that going to cripple the whole site? Well, maybe not. Maybe the ransomware has to be just a little more intelligent to reach out to file shares and drop copies of itself, or start exploiting vulnerabilities in the industrial space because it's so hard to patch these things. And basically just start making a mess of things and trigger a shutdown. Now you're in a position to say, I will reverse the damage if you pay me. So I see this as coming because of the industrial internet, because of the imperative to have central management over these updates, because the central management system has the power to change software in these industrial sites.
Okay, but let's be clear then. Is the problem central management and IIoT and cloud management? Because that is a growing sector in the industrial security field. A lot of folks are proponents of connecting these systems for some security reasons. You have a centralized cloud manager. They can respond to attacks in different parts of the world much quicker and in a more organized way than just one site could on its own. Are you saying that the risks outweigh those benefits?
People confuse monitoring with control. There's enormous benefit to monitoring security. You can only optimize what you measure. So we better be out there measuring the security of our industrial systems. The most efficient way to measure these things is in large central sites, often on the internet. But that doesn't mean that we're going to give those large central sites on the internet the power to control safety critical systems in our physical operations. That's not how it works. What we see people doing is, yes, connecting out to the internet. Often, at Waterfall, we do unidirectional gateways, often through a unidirectional gateway so that nothing can get back in. How do you do software updates? You have a software update server in the OT network for that class of industrial internet device. You pull the software update from the vendor into a test bed. You test it for a while, and you deploy it in the OT update server only after you're confident that the thing is not going to cause either a malware malfunction or just a sort of routine errors and omissions malfunction, because there's mistakes in this software from time to time. So there are solutions out there. You can use the internet, but if we're not asking the right question, if we're saying, do we trust the organization instead of do we trust their website? If we ask the wrong question, we're going to get the wrong answers.
All right, now let's get back to some of those trends that we were talking about earlier, Andrew. What else is happening these days? What else should people be aware of and look out for?
Let me come back to Gartner again. They issued a prediction in July of 2021. Their prediction was that by 2025, cyber attackers will weaponize OT environments to successfully harm or kill humans.
Yeah, that's something that we always talk about, and we always understand in theory it can happen, but that is, of course, a really serious claim. So, Andrew, can you give me some examples of what kinds of harmful OT attacks, what dangerous OT attacks could be possible in the near future?
Well, the classic example that everybody cites is Triton, which was a sophisticated attack on a safety system at a petrochemical facility in the Middle East. If you disable a safety system, then and you cause a safety incident like a fire at the site or an explosion, now the safety systems don't work to protect human life, and you have potentially casualties. But the Gartner Group didn't go into a lot of detail in their prediction. I just saw the press release, and it might be that they're thinking a little more broadly than industrial operations, because you could argue that a self-driving car is a cyber-physical system, and you could easily see casualties from tampering with software in self-driving cars. What I worry about, though, is more specific. I worry about small water systems. I'm working on a report right now for Canada Public Safety with recommendations for small water systems for cybersecurity. Because you think about it, small water systems, the water system for Oldsmar, Florida, the water system for a small town of 5,000 people. Well, you've got 5,000 people at risk if you, not if you tamper with the way they tried to do it at Oldsmar. All you have to do is tamper with the treatment system and send untreated water into the drinking water system. And now people drink this stuff and they get sick, and some of them are going to die. A small system, serving 5,000 people, serving 10,000 people, how much money do they have? They have enough money to bury pipe and to hire some technicians to keep the pipe working. If there's a breach, they can dig down and they can fix the pipe. They have enough people to bill for this stuff. They hardly have an IT person. They certainly don't have an industrial security expert on staff. They outsource everything. It's all done by contractors. How are they going to do robust cybersecurity, life-critical cybersecurity? And the bad guys, are beginning to figure this out, is what I worry about. That the consequences of compromise are, in a sense, just as bad if you kill people in a 5,000 person town versus a 5 million person city. The consequences are unacceptable in the small water systems, and the defenses are much less than the large water systems. We urgently need our small systems to be better defended. And so, as I said, I'm working on this recommendation for the smallest systems, saying what can you do to have robust cybersecurity on a minimal budget. This is what I take out of this prediction. This is sort of the concrete action that I'm taking in reaction to this kind of stuff coming down the pipe.
Andrew, that is a really interesting use case that I'm not sure I've ever thought about in detail. What is the answer to the problem that you just introduced?
Well, it's going to be like a 40 or 50 page paper. So let me just give you sort of one insight. In short, the methodology I'm going to recommend is the secure operations technology methodology that I documented in my second book, the Black Book. But let me give you just one concrete example, a nugget, sort of to wrap your head around. The very smallest water treatment utilities. Everybody wants to save money, and so everybody tries to automate to whatever degree they can to reduce labor costs and make money. And the lifeblood of modern automation is data in motion, connections. But of course, every connection, every connection that lets information move lets attacks move, because cyber attacks are information. So one of my key recommendations for the smallest sites is you've got to give up some of the benefits of automation. I'm sorry, it's going to cost you a little bit. And you're going to deploy an air gap. It's old school, but it's dirt cheap. You don't have to buy anything to deploy an air gap. And now it doesn't matter how clever the bad guys get on the internet. Nothing can get into the site. Now you have to worry about USB drives, and you have to worry about the contractors that you're hiring, carrying their laptops in. Now we shift focus from, oh shoot, what am I going to do with technology to protect myself? You shift focus to how am I going to change my contract language to keep my contractors from dragging malware into my air-gapped site. And it simplifies a huge number of pieces of the puzzle. So that's a sort of a preview into one of the conclusions of the report.
So what are the other, would you say, industries right now that are most at risk or most unprepared? I'm thinking of, it was a big story in 2020, but it did roll over into 2021, and it's going to continue to be a problem, is hospitals, right? As long as we're in a pandemic, they're going to be a major target of both IT and OT attacks.
I haven't seen sort of peer-reviewed numbers, sort of scientific numbers. But my best instinct is that, we all know a lot of hospitals have been hit with ransomware. And every time the hospital's hit with ransomware, things slow down. There's a risk, surgeries get canceled. When this happens, people's lives are at risk. Now, can you say that this person died because of that ransomware attack? That's hard to do case by case, because the ransomware is hard to relate directly to an individual case, and there's hundreds and thousands of people in these big hospitals. But if you look statistically, if you delay enough important surgeries, if you delay enough, confuse enough records and treatment information, statistically you're going to have people die. And to the Gartner prediction that by 2025, cyber attackers will have weaponized OT environments to successfully harm or kill humans, I suggest that's happening already in hospitals, that there are people who are dying who would not have died otherwise if the hospital system, some of them, had not been crippled. What Gartner's predicting is that this is going to be done deliberately in the future, as opposed to, in a sense, accidentally, which I believe we're seeing already at hospitals.
What are we supposed to take away from all this, right? In the course of half an hour now, you and I have talked about major issues affecting water treatment plants, hospitals, 30% of critical infrastructure organizations by 2025 being hit mission critical, cloud-seeded ransomware, hundreds or thousands of targets at once. It's a little bit doom and gloom. What are we supposed to take away from all this?
One of the takeaways, the sort of the truism in the space is that cyber attacks only get worse over time. And, here's evidence of that happening. And, this evidence, I'm producing a report of attacks and trends. This evidence is useful because attacks are what we use to measure the strength of our security postures. We have two different security postures. We're thinking of an improvement to a security system. What we should be doing is evaluating that system against a spectrum of possible attacks. Recent attacks we've observed, attacks we're predicting are going to hit us in the lifetime of the system, because these industrial systems, they last for a long time. They're slow to change. So we've got to anticipate the threat environment. So yes, everything's getting worse, but we need to know specifically how it's getting worse so that we can design industrial security systems to withstand what we expect to be the next several years' attacks until the next opportunity we have to upgrade our security.
Yeah, now that you mention it, it strikes me that only a couple of episodes ago we had Graham speak on, and what I seem to gather from what he was talking about is that industrial security, we're doing pretty well. Things are pretty fine and dandy. Our systems are far more robust than they were before. We shouldn't be too worried. I don't want to put words in his mouth. Does all of this track with what he was saying? Do we disagree?
I think I disagree a little bit with Graham, but I'm not going to argue with him. He's not here to defend himself. It's not fair to argue with him. I will point out that most of he admitted that most of his experience in the field is in the oil and gas industry, and oil and gas, large refineries or offshore platforms. These facilities are heavily defended. Oil and gas is an industry that makes a lot of money, and they spend that money to make sure they can keep making money. So, yes, there's been lots of progress in some industries. I think there's a lot of work to do in other industries. And, really the question here is not gloom and doom, oh, we're all going to die. The prediction here is, look, this is what's coming at us. If we want, let's say we have, let's say I agree with Graham. Let's say we have a class of industries, a set of industries that, has done a really good job so far. Every one of them is tracking these attacks. Every one of them is making these predictions about the future. Every one of them is saying, what do we have to do now to make sure that we stay, thoroughly protected through the next couple of years? So, the question is not gloom and doom, we're all going down. The question is not, are we secure or not? The question is, how secure are we? How secure do we need to be? How much is enough? And that answer changes year by year, and we need to track this and we need to act on it.
So it seems to me that the attackers are getting better, their attacks are getting more sophisticated and more dangerous, but our security is getting better, and we need to continue to keep up or else face the consequences.
Absolutely.
All right, then with that, Andrew, we always, in tradition, leave our guests with the final word. In this case, you're our guest. So what is the final word you'd like to take us out with?
I think what I'll leave people with is, if you would like to keep up with this stuff, this space, the threat space, I am working on a report analyzing what happened in 2021 with some predictions for 2022. I am working, as I said, with Canada Public Safety on some advice for them. I've got a couple of reports on threats actually in progress coming up out of the next 2 months. If you'd like to, keep up with this stuff and, get access to these reports when they come out, feel free to go to the Waterfall website, waterfall-security.com. Go on the resources menu under blog. Click on any of the blog posts, because these reports will come out with the blog. But on the right of the blog post, you'll see a newsletter sign-up form. Sign up for the newsletter. You'll get notifications when these reports come to light.
Andrew, as always, thank you for speaking with me.
Thank you, Nate, for driving this whole process with your very good questions.
Well, this has been the Industrial Security Podcast from Waterfall. Thank you to all our listeners who make this show possible. We have some really exciting episodes coming up in 2022. I hope you'll stay tuned.